Thank you, Wojciech. Thank you, and Jeff, for organizing. Thank you, the program, for having us, really. And also thank you to the Templeton Foundation for funding. Now, before I start, I'm kind of nervous a little about, breaking this reign of the words of love moment, but here goes. So famously, it was Plato who, unlike pretty much all of the other philosophers, advocated for erotic love. Erotic love, as portrayed in the symposium, is formative. It constitutes the first step in a progressive transformation and development of the philosophy. In my own reading of the motif of erotic love in Kierkegaard, I will employ a similar perspective. What I'm trying to say is that Kierkegaard acknowledges the deep and formative experience of erotic love, and, at least in this interpretation, erotic love stands at the beginning of a higher or deeper subjectivity. Erotic love is formative. It shapes and terrifies, and it pervades disturbingly the person thus affected. Or rather, it is erotic love which makes him or her a real person in this interpretation. Now, I would argue that Kierkegaard was indeed the author who attributed to sexuality an absolutely fundamental importance. I, however, believe that Kierkegaard, the neurotic, consistently hid this central concern of his under euphemisms, under metaphors, and that he was never really able to admit to this attitude. In order to demonstrate my thesis about the centrality of erotic love or sexuality, I will first discuss in the following section a seemingly insignificant text from 1845, which in English has the title, A Cursory Observation Concerning a Detail in Don Giovanni. Next, we encounter the problem of seduction, to which the victim, Zerlina, doesn't succumb. In the third part, I pose the question what this supposed victory of hers means. And the answer is indeed ambiguous. Zerlina loses precisely because she has won. Love is formative in, like the Felix Culpa, in that it lends the double-edged sword of personhood, of inwardness, of the self, of the spirit. So Zerlina should have told herself, to quote the song Waterloo by the Swedish group ABBA, I feel like I win when I lose. I will try to interpret the motif of erotic love through the prism of the concept of anxiety and show that the apple, perhaps, is a metaphor. Finally, I will conclude by trying to suggest that the motif of erotic love, which typically in Kierkegaard takes the shape of seduction, plays a key role in the authorship, and that it is constitutive not only of subjectivity, but also of intersubjective relations. Okay, so firstly, a cursory observation and the Danish Don Giovanni. In May 1845, Kierkegaard publishes a newspaper article, which is divided into two parts and is called A Cursory Observation Concerning a Detail in Don Giovanni. Now he publishes it pseudonymously, then he, in a letter to Madame Heiberg, he admits to being the author later, but his pseudonym at the time is A, so he references it to the author of the first part of Either Or. The occasion for his article is a new performance of the Mozart opera, which was in Denmark, very much like in Germany, staged under the title Don Juan. I don't need to explain to the present audience that Don Juan is a character, and moreover, the treatment of the classical substance that is Mozart's opera to a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte was of fundamental importance to Kierkegaard. So much so, in fact, that he wrote in his diary in 1839, and it was under the influence of the 1837 production of Don Giovanni, I quote, in certain respects, I can say of Don Juan what Elvira says to him, you murderer of my happiness. For to tell the truth, it is this piece which affected me so diabolically that I can never forget it. It was this piece which drove me, like Elvira, out of the cloister's quiet night. End quote. It's interesting that around this time in late 1830s, he must have brought his then fiancée, Regina Olsen, to the performance. But, and I'm quoting from the home supplement to the Corsair Affair volume, after a few bars of the overture, he let her out again, with the remark that this was sufficient. For a proper comprehension of the opera, or for the proper mood, there was enough in the few bars. What a fiancé. Yeah. Kierkegaard had to wait 5 years for a new performance, and between 1840 and 45, Don Giovanni was not in the repertoire. This is the new production of 1845 that is the subject of the cursory observation. I want to note, or make a little contextual reading of the problem, that in contrast to our practices today, the staging of Don Giovanni in Kierkegaard's time was very different. And here's at least a few differences. So firstly, the opera was staged in Danish, which was similar to neighboring Germany. Not that they did it in Danish in Germany, but they did it in Germany. At first, from 1807 onwards, it was a translation by Lauritz Kruse. From 1845, the production had a new or more recent improved translation by N.L.C. Abraham. Not only was it a translation, but it was a libretto in which there were really major differences from the Italian origin. The first substantive difference from the usual ways in which Don Giovanni is staged today was that it was customary in those times to give the so-called Viennese version of the opera. Don Giovanni was first staged in Prague in 1887, and today it is customary, even though not exclusively, to stage this original version, the Prague version. The Viennese version, however, was more in keeping with the romantic spirit of the first half of the 19th century. And it doesn't include the scena ultima, the final scene, where the seducer's ruin is somehow moralized, and which the scene, articulates a moral lesson that those who sin will also receive just retribution. So Kierkegaard didn't see this scene in the 1845 version in Copenhagen. Next, there are some scenes and passages which are missing, on the contrary, from the Vienna version, which is also interesting. It was also absolutely characteristic of the way that they would stage Italian operas at the time, at least in the sphere of influence of the German Singspiel, that they would replace recitatives by dialogue. This practice, in fact, was lively debated at the time. So I'm quoted from the commentary to the Danish edition. While Johann Ludwig Heiberg wrote in an article on Don Juan that the Danish treatment of Don Juan is undoubtedly the best that exists. Okay, I guess. It was Hans Christian Andersen who criticized the Royal Theatre for omitting recitatives. Of course, even more interesting than the fact that recitatives were replaced by dialogues is the fact that these dialogues were freely translated or spontaneously formulated. It's simply not an exact translation. So when I quoted above, Donna Elvira exclaiming, sorry, "You murderer of my happiness," this is not Lorenzo da Ponte's text. It's Lauritz Kruse, which is a fact that is not even commented on by the Danish publishers, actually. Moreover, he in particular uses material, so Kruse, from other authors in these dialogues, typically from Molière's Don Juan. So it is interesting to consider what versions of the opera Kierkegaard knew at all. Elisabeth de Souza, in her excellent article on Kierkegaard Mozart, points out that the very few cases when in Copenhagen, so she does list the cases when there was Don Giovanni sung in Italian in Copenhagen. There were about 5 of these occasions. What is beyond doubt is that the author must have known the Italian libretto, at least to some extent. We know that he quotes the famous motto of the diary of the seducer's diary, "Sua passione predominante, la giovane principiante," in Italian. So he definitely knew the libretto, and we have other examples, including a reference in Italian to the aria Batia Bati il mio mazzetto in the 1845 article. So that's my context, and I can move to Kierkegaard's analysis. His first concern is with the singing performance of a certain Jürgen Hansen. Oh, well, yeah. As in his later and in many ways complementary text, which is called The Crisis and a Crisis in the Life of an Actress, he basically discusses the connection between acting, delivery, mood, and so on. And both these articles, they really are complementary, and he comments on them that they have this role of declaring the continuity of the aesthetic in the authorship in the second phase of the literary activity. In this paper, I, however, want to focus on the motif that is the real core of the article, and that is Zerlina. Zerlina is one of the three female characters in Mozart's opera, and like the other two, she experiences Don Juan at work, so to speak. So the opera itself, to at least briefly summarize the main storyline, begins with the failed seduction of Donna Anna, who is defended by her father, the famous Commendatore, whom Don Juan kills in a duel, and then he flees. Next, he encounters his former victim, Donna Elvira, who is looking for him and wants to force him into the promised marriage. Thirdly, Don Juan bursts into the country wedding where Zerlina is about to marry Mazzetto. However, Don Juan disposes of the fiancé and attempts to seduce Zerlina. I'll discuss this scene in a bit. In the second act, the characters are gradually brought together in a punitive quest to bring about Don Juan's reformation and punishment. In the end, his downfall comes after the stone statue of the Commendatore arrives to dinner, and Don Juan is swallowed by hell. Like I said, after this, there would be the Scena Ultima, but not in the Viennese version. So that's just this, romantic hero being, it's like, stopped in his tracks, but never repentant. That's important. He never repents. So Zerlina is thus the subject of the article, and Kierkegaard himself is aware that this is a rare occurrence. It's not so rare in the context of Kierkegaard's work, because we know that he's dealt with these women who are the victims of seducers before in the either-or silhouettes, So he talks about Maria, about Donna Elvira, and about Margherita. Zerlina, as already mentioned, is a country girl who is to marry Mazzetto. Don Juan disrupts her wedding, he sends the wedding party to the castle, and is left alone with the girl. That dialogue leads to the famous aria, a duettino, La ci darem la mano, which is the subject of Kierkegaard's central concern. So now I'll try to show you the aria and something I hope interesting about the translations, because this is different versions. So we have Lauritz Grusser, this is an 1822 edition. Then we have Abraham, 1845, and then we have Da Ponte. And I've tried somehow to translate it. I hope that I haven't done it too badly. But what I really wanted to show is the difference, that it just isn't the same text at all, So I'll keep it up a little bit, and then I'll be commenting a little on the first exchange between Don Juan and Zerlina, especially on the Vorrei and non Vorrei part. At first glance, it's obvious that the arias themselves were not spared from interventions. So it's not only the recitatives where Messrs. Cruz and Abraham employed their poetic creativity. It's also interesting how markedly the first passage by Don Juan differs in the two translations also. So it's not just that they're different from the origin, they're different between themselves. Here's reading of the scene where Zerlina succumbs to his call, so they basically walk away together, is such that she, throughout the scene, doesn't know what is happening. She's seduced without noticing. He says, Selina's seduction is a quiet marriage that goes off without any fuss. Selina is somehow at the very beginning of any spiritual development. He says, Selina is deemed not to have the qualifications of individuality. Or then he says also, if reflection is attributed to her at this point, the whole opera is a failure. Of course, this is a seduction from which there is a way back. For before they really go where Don Juan is taking her, to the gazebo, Donna Elvira intervenes and she saves the poor Selina. So again, Keo assumes that Selina doesn't know why is she even being rescued? Like, what's happening? What does this woman want with us? You know? Because nothing is happening. That's Keo's interpretation. Finally, later, she has no reason to be guilty or to encourage her fiancé to punish her. I quote, let a few years go by and then pay a visit to Madame Mazzetto. You will find Selina essentially unchanged. Unquote. So Selina remains equally devoid of reflection and of a deeper. In this sense, she is fundamentally different from the examples of seduced women that I've listed above, to which Keo adds Donna Anna in the article. In them, there's always a certain development through seduction, though never really positive also. In other words, love, seduction has a formative role here, at least in Keo's reading and his interpretations, since it results in a certain developmental constitution of the personality. Selina, on the other hand, remains the same as at the beginning, and he says in the 1845 article, because essentially Selina is neither seduced or saved, but is continually in trouble. End quote. And I would say that the real in trouble that is at stake here is precisely her essential absence of a deeper spiritual existence. She's defined by her essential ignorance and innocence. So my third part, Selina, Adam, and the beginning. So in this section of my paper, I want to proceed to a deeper interpretation of the problem of formative love. And my first step is by commenting on the motif that I've already hinted at rather transparently in my last comment on the cursory observation. What I'm really saying, and very clearly saying, is the seduction, that Selina's seduction structurally repeats the basic moments of Adam's fall in the interpretation of Vigilius Aufniensis in the concept of anxiety. So the structure that I'm referring to is primarily the connection between, on the one hand, ignorance and innocence, and anxiety. The first part, ignorance and innocence, well, in the concept of anxiety, the formulation reads famously at the beginning of the 5th paragraph, innocence is ignorance, and innocence, man is not qualified as spirit, but is psychologically qualified in immediate unity with his natural condition, the spirit and man in dreaming. We have in the 1845 article a beautiful, thus it all began in an innocent dreaming formulation. So on the other hand, we have anxiety, which is the defining mood of the situation. But as the question, is Selina in anxiety? Now, reading the Danish text was a little shock to me because I knew it in the Italian libretto, and for quite a long time, I've actually been using this aria as the perfect example for students of what Keo means when he says that anxiety is sympathetic antipathic that it has the sympathetic antipathic determination, that it's at the same time drawing the anxious person to itself and repulsing. In particular, this is how I read the first part of the aria, where she utters to herself, so she's really saying this in her mind, in response to the suggestion by Don Juan that they retire together to a nearby gazebo. So that's what I'll be looking at right here. Lorenzo da Ponte, in my view, articulates here the perfect balance between the attraction of the offer and the simultaneous terror that Selina has of it. She would like to, but at the same time, she would not. Vorrei e non vorrei. That's at least In the Italian, we have the conditional. It is I would like to, and I wouldn't like to. The Danish really says I will, no, I won't, I don't want to. It's so definitive. I don't read the beautiful sympathetic antipathy as in the Italian. So the Danish translation, I really think, vulgarizes this ambiguity and tender emotion with sharp retorts. It's also that in the Italian, we have the second beautiful line, my heart is trembling a little, which is also perfect anxiety. So in cursory observation itself, and I'll just stop this. So in the cursory observation itself, Kierkegaard describes Zerlina as one who is, I quote, confused, dazed, and perplexed. In my reading, she's the perfect embodiment of anxiety. Further, in terms of structural similarity, it is an anxiety that takes on a more concrete form as it happens vis-a-vis Don Juan's proposition, or it materializes in a particular idea. So this anxiety is then set in the same context as that of the concept of anxiety, which is sinfulness. In Adam's case, it is prohibition, which is exactly this concrete idea. And then in Zerlina's case, it is this commitment and moral prohibition given by the fact that she's about to be married. In this anxiety, Zerlina is deciding whether or not to submit to what she doesn't really understand. In the case of the other seduced, we know what happened to them afterwards. Kierkegaard characteristically speaks of Donna Elvira in the Silhouettes, but even in the cursory observation, he describes that Elvira is a tremendous feminine character with the essential passion to know what it means to be seduced. Which is also like, what does it even mean? Essential passion to know what it means to be seduced. I have no idea. If you know, tell me. So Elvira is desperate, betrayed, but in this sense also has a distinct self. Donna Anna, who is also referred to, is, I quote, essentially developed. And so this is sufficient to disturb her for perhaps the rest of her life. So in other words, Donna Anna is aware of the situation and is, like Donna Elvira, at an essentially higher stage of spiritual development. But let me ask, so what actually happens to Zerlina? So Zerlina doesn't succumb. She's saved. And thus somehow she never crosses that qualitative threshold beyond which, as Haufnians is constantly right, psychology cannot go. That boundary, in this case, in the case of Adam, is the sinful fall. But how is this boundary defined in the case of Zerlina? It really is a question because the situation is perfectly paradoxical. Zerlina has already indeed left with the Don, walking to the gazebo. But at the same time, she has not succumbed fully. There's still time for her to be saved. So this is a key moment. That fall, that apple that is at stake here, is not just a matter of will or decision, it is an act. If we were to ask whether or not Zerlina is seduced, the answer really would be as if she were already. We could even say she's anxious as if she were already seduced. Here, of course, I repeat the formulation from the concept of anxiety. I quote Haufnians. In this way, innocence is brought to its uttermost. In anxiety, it is related to the forbidden and to the punishment. Innocence is not guilty, yet there is anxiety as though it were lost. And at the same time, it's not lost. In the case we're discussing, of course, it is the physical act of love that has not occurred. Because it hasn't occurred, Kierkegaard can claim that Zerlina is still innocent and ignorant. The discriminating factor really is sexuality. Zerlina and her anxiety of a seduced woman becomes, in my interpretation, the model for reading the concept of anxiety. Indeed, I think it makes perfect sense to understand the physical love, act of love, as a situation in which there happens the positing of the spirit Haufnians writes about. In the 5th and 6th paragraphs of the first chapter, Haufnians deals with the problem of the awakening of the spirit, its positing or its constitution as the basis of the anthropological synthesis of the body, soul, spirit. Now he connects this positing to the fall, or rather Adam in this essential sense, together with the positing of sin. So interestingly enough, Hafniensis relates this situation to sexuality. I quote, "The consequence of the fall is a double one. That sin came into the world and that sexuality was posited. The one is to be inseparable from the other," end quote. Hafniensis thus considers sexuality as a consequence together with sin. But what sexuality is he really talking about here? One way, and I really think that it's the usual way of reading this, is that Adam and Eve are ashamed. The situation of them hiding in the bushes and the positing of sexuality here corresponds to the fact in this reading that bodiliness is suddenly determined sexually, namely in sexual or generic difference. The body, as it were, ceases to be a kind of indeterminate, angelic body that becomes sexually determined. The problem I see with this interpretation is that Kierkegaard makes it clear in the concept of anxiety that modesty is already present in Eve and Adam before the fall. I quote, "With innocence, a knowledge begins that has ignorance as its first qualification." This is the concept of modesty, sham. In modesty, there's an anxiety because spirit is found at the extreme point of the difference of the synthesis in such a way that spirit is not merely qualified as body, but as a body with a generic difference. Nevertheless, modesty is a knowledge of the generic difference, but not as a relation to a generic difference, which is to say the sexual urge as such is not present. I'm still quoting. "The real significance of modesty is that spirit, so to speak, cannot acknowledge itself at the extreme point of the synthesis." End quote. So in so many words, I think that Hafniensis sees modesty as a mood in which one arrives precisely due to the sexual difference, which one accepts. One accepts the sexual difference, but at the same time, the person avoids the full or complete consequence. So one can relate oneself to oneself as a male or female body, but not as a body that in this determination can be, so to speak, exercised in the sexual act. So Hafniensis is clearly speaking of sexuality in the context of sexual drive, realized sexuality. I quote, "In the moment, the spirit posits itself, it posits the synthesis, but in order to posit the synthesis, it must first pervade it differentiatingly. And the ultimate point of the sensuous is precisely the sexual." In my reading, Kierkegaard, the neurotic, confesses to the role of sexuality, to the fundamental formative effect of the experience, which affects a person in his or her completeness, and at the same time in such a way that in this completeness, he or she experiences utter contradiction. His neurotic confession, however, by the same token banishes sexuality from the realm of the spirit. Once the work of this serving spirit is done, it should go. The sexuality begins history, that's what he says very clearly, and history suppresses this humble beginning for which it remains ashamed. Of course, Selina doesn't sin. She doesn't fall, she remains innocent. In the concept of anxiety, Hafniensis poses an interesting question. What would have happened to Adam if he had not sinned? It's also interesting that he asks this question twice and answers that only fools ask this question. But then he asks it a third time, and I get the impression that it's probably not such a stupid question. And this time he answers. He says, "Not to speak foolishly and by way of accommodation, had Adam not sinned, he would in the same moment have passed over into eternity." Well, Adam wouldn't have been swallowed up by heaven as Don Juan was swallowed by hell. But something similar to Selina would have happened to him. He would have retained eternal ignorance. So my conclusion, I think it's legitimate to ask what the role of the motifs of seduction, eroticism, and sexuality played in Kierkegaard's work, and specifically in his anthropology. I find it a rather glib answer, that it was just this particular dialogue that he had with Regina Olsen. It was just this dialogue whose purpose was to extricate her from the relationship she had with our neurotic author. I don't think that clear that this relationship certainly played a large part. This cannot be denied. But I really don't believe that she is the only reader, so to speak. The second point of view to the problem of eroticism and sexuality in Kierkegaard would be, and I also reject this attempt or this cheap attempt to scandalize. It's also certainly true that Kierkegaard admits to wanting to attract the attention of the multitude, that he therefore shocked people deliberately with Seducer's Diary. To put it another way would be to say that he deliberately chose a subject that was so far removed as possible from his real interest, which, at least according to later declarations, is Christianity. But I'm not satisfied with this answer, simply because it doesn't explain why would Kierkegaard devote such deep analyses to this shocking and provocative material, and why would he make it such a fundamental theme of many of his texts? Nor is it enough for me to explain that what is ultimately at stake is the meiotic, that seduction is basically just Socratic dialogue, that it is in effect part of the indirect communication. This explanation, while again it's largely correct, it doesn't take into account the clearly sexual or carnal side of love that is present in these texts. The fact is that at the same time as agape, Kierkegaard is concerned with eros. I won't be able to adequately substantiate my final thesis at this point, but I believe that the motif of seduction and love, which I understand here to be formative, is really a constitutive interpretive framework which occupies the same place in Kierkegaard's thought as the dialectic of master and slave in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I've elsewhere tried to demonstrate that in the Seducer's Diary, there really is the dialectic of master of slave very present, that he is very aware, and that he somehow, I believe, really takes a very similar scheme in his work. But differently, Either Or is a book about love. And the Seducer's Diary is really the self-consciousness chapter of this book. We tend to constantly read Kierkegaard as the author of the strict conception of the single individual as isolated and essentially incapable of true subjectivity. The one text that's always quoted or cited as exception is the works of love, obviously, and we're doing it in all 2 days, really talking about intersubjectivity in the works of love. My reading, however, says that Kierkegaard understands bodily love as a constitutive moment in which subjectivity and intersubjectivity are simultaneously constituted, where the other appears with radical vehemence. Seduction is asymmetrical in Kierkegaard. It results in victims. It is a kind of unhappy consciousness, which is the result of seduction. In his work, Kierkegaard seems to be, to follow this Hegelian thread, he seems to be searching for a way, very much like Hegel, under the heading of recognition, which is the real crowning jewel of the work of the Phenomenology of Spirit as such. He seeks for a balanced, equilibrative intersubjectivity. And I believe that the works of love is his attempt at such solution. So for Kierkegaard, in my judgment, love is the most important phenomenon of at least pre-Christian human existence. Love is formative, but it occupies this realm precisely where it isn't merely abstract or imagined, like what I talked about yesterday, but where it touches on the contradiction of the synthesis of the physical and the psychical that is posited, established, and sustained by the spirit. In this sense, formative love is physical, and there is in it the beginning of a higher sense of the self. And thank you for bearing with me.